For Pride Month, we're not just celebrating, we're also remembering. We're diving into a complicated, painful, and ultimately transformative story of how psychoanalysis has evolved in its understanding of the LGBTQ+ identities. In the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud, the founder of Psychoanalysis, offered a theory of sexuality that was revolutionary for his time. He saw homosexuality as a form of developmental arrest, often explained through the lens of Oedipal complex. Freud believed that if a child failed to identify with the same-sex parent, they might develop same-sex desire. But Freud wasn't as rigid as many of his followers. In a now famous 1935 letter to a mother worried about her son being gay, Freud wrote, "Homosexuality is absurdly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of." He went on to say that homosexuality was not a disease and could not and should not be cured. In some ways, Freud left the door open, but it was the analysts who came after him, particularly in the mid-20th century, who slammed it shut. Patients were often treated with guilt-inducing interpretation, reparative therapy, or worse, outright rejection. By the 1950s and 60s, psychoanalysis became the dominant force in American psychiatry, and it doubled down on the idea that homosexuality was pathological. Homosexuality was officially listed as a mental disorder in the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual (DSM) in 1952. Analysts like Irvin Bieber and Charles Socrates became some of the most vocal proponents of the idea that homosexuality was not just a symptom, but a full-blown psychological disorder, one that should and could be treated. In 1962, Bieber published a book called Homosexuality, a Psychoanalytic Study, based on the interviews with over 100 gay men who had been in psychoanalytic treatment. His conclusion was that homosexuality was the result of a specific family dynamic, an emotionally distant or hostile father, paired with an overprotective or intrusive mother. Bieber believed this disrupted the boy's ability to identify with his father and led to fixation on the same sex. Charles Socrates, another influential figure of the time, took these ideas even further. He argued that homosexuality was a form of arrested development and claimed it was treatable, even curable, through psychoanalysis. He often used terms like pathology, perversion, and maladjustment, reinforcing the idea that same-sex attraction was the deviation from healthy development. Both men were deeply committed to the notion that homosexuality was learned, not innate, and because of that belief, they insisted it could be reversed. This framework became incredibly influential, not just in psychoanalysis, but in courts, schools, and churches. Their work gave intellectual cover to conversion therapy, and it provided justification for discrimination in medicine, policy, and culture. Their views, published in major articles, taught in training institutions, helped cement the idea that the LGBTQ+ people were fundamentally broken and in need of repair. They led to decades of unnecessary sufferings for patients who were told their identity was a disease. LGBTQ+ patients were referred to therapy, not for support, but for correction. This era saw the rise of what we now call conversion therapy, which included talk therapy aimed at uncovering hidden trauma, behavioral conditioning to suppress same-sex desire, and deeply harmful techniques like aversion therapy, electric shock, and forced heterosexual dating. The tide began to shift in the 1970s, not because psychiatry suddenly became more compassionate, but because the LGBTQ+ people refused to be erased. The gay liberation movement, sparked by events the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, created a cultural and political reckoning. LGBTQ+ people were no longer just patients or subjects of study. They were organizers, writers, thinkers, protesters, demanding to be seen not as disordered, but as human. One of the most striking moments came in 1970 and 1971, when LGBTQ activists disrupted the American Psychiatric Association's annual meeting. Protesters confronted leading psychiatrists holding up signs that read, "Psychiatry is the enemy," and "We are the experts on our lives." They stormed the stage, shouted down speakers, and demanded an end to the classification of homosexuality as a mental illness. The pressure was impossible to ignore. In 1972, a gay psychiatrist, still closeted at the time, took the stage at the APA's convention in disguise, using the pseudonym Dr. H. Anonymous, and wearing a mask to protect his identity. He told the audience, "I am a homosexual, I am a psychiatrist, I am a member of the APA, and I am afraid." The room felt silent. His testimony laid bare the fear, isolation, and hypocrisy that lives inside the profession. That moment marked a turning point. In 1973, after intense lobbying, public pressure, and internal debate, the APA voted to remove homosexuality from Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, no longer classifying it as a mental disorder. It was a historic victory, but it didn't mean that the work was over. It meant the fight had finally begun to be recognized. Even if psychiatry began to change in 1970s and 80s, psychoanalysis lagged behind. The field that once claimed to be the deepest path to knowledge was, in many ways, the most resistant to change. The American Psychoanalytic Association, one of the oldest and most powerful training institutions in the country, continued to uphold policies that actively excluded openly gay and lesbian individuals from becoming psychoanalysts. It wasn't a passive oversight. It was an explicit, institutionalized ban. Candidates who disclosed their sexuality were either rejected outright or told to remain closeted if they wanted to be admitted. Many LGBTQ trainees were forced to lie on applications, suppress their identities in supervision, or endure interpretations that framed their sexuality as pathological. This created a chilling effect, a message that said, "You can explore the unconscious, but only if you keep that part of yours hidden." While the broader psychiatric community had removed homosexuality from the DSM in 1973, the American Psychoanalytic Association didn't formally lift its discriminatory policy until 1991. That's nearly 2 decades later. Only then did it declare that openly gay and lesbian people could train and serve as analysts. The delay didn't due to lack of evidence or clinical insight. It was due to fear, oppression, and an unwillingness to listen by the organized psychiatry. Change only came because LGBTQ analysts, students, and allies pushed relentlessly, organizing inside and out the system, publishing critiques, and calling out hypocrisy at the highest level of psychoanalytic leadership. Today, psychoanalysis is no longer a single, authoritative voice. The field has shifted from the therapist being the one who knows to the one who strives to be with the patient, seeking to understand their lived experience. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" they began to ask, "What has it been like to be you in a world that wasn't made for you?" The American Psychoanalytic Association has since issued formal apologies for its past harms and now actively supports LGBTQ rights and inclusions in training and leadership. But harm isn't erased by apology, and inclusion isn't the end goal. Transformation is. So where does this leave us? The history of psychoanalysis and LGBTQ people is a story of harm, but also a story of resistance, reckoning, and renewal. This evolution didn't come from the top down. It came from activists, patients, and clinicians who dared to speak the truth. Activism has always been at the heart of mental health progress. Without it, homosexuality might still be seen as a disorder. Today, the fight continues to challenge bias in care, to expand access, and to ensure that therapy is a place of affirmation, not erasure. If we want a more just future for mental health, we have to remember, progress doesn't happen because systems get better. It happens because people refuse to be erased.